You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, censorship. It has become more or less a dirty word in our society, but does it have to be that way? Is it possible to achieve an acceptable balance between freedom of expression and the protection of society from the profane, the violent, and the hateful? And who should be making those difficult decisions? Today on the show, we'll explore all of the issues and hear some very different opinions. I also want to hear what you have to say about it, and the phones will be open to take your calls when we come back right after this. Achieving the balance between censorship and freedom of expression. Where do you draw the line? And who should be making those decisions? With his thoughts on all of this, we're joined in studio by Robert Warren. He's the chair of the Ontario Film Review Board. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, censorship, as I said at the top of the show, really has become almost a dirty word in our society. It certainly has negative connotations, but does it really have to be that way?
I don't think so. Every developed country and society today has a film censorship and film classification board. And basically what the board does is we draw lines and we say, okay, this is the community standards, this is how far we feel the community is prepared to go in allowing these images to be shown, particularly to children. And that's what we do. This is our job, to have those community standards reflected in our decisions.
So how do you draw that line?
Well, it's an interesting process because the way we're constituted has a lot to do with it, because we have part-time members, just ordinary people, about 30 people that come from all over Ontario, different walks of life, different ethnic backgrounds, trying to represent the province of Ontario and all the different diverse views there. And anytime we make any changes to our guidelines, we debate all these changes quite a bit in full board meetings we have. And we reflect, we hope, the community standards of the province in doing that.
So who judges, though, what community standards are? And really, should we be using community standards as the measuring stick for this?
I think the people that judge it are the ordinary people of the province, and hopefully our board reflects that. You know, it's not the academics, it's not the politicians that make these judgments, it's the ordinary people of the community that make these judgments of what's acceptable. And that's why we have our board set up the way we have.
But when you have such a dramatic shift in public acceptability, and that certainly has been changing and evolving over the years, how do you know where and when to draw the line?
Well,
because I know that you're not directly involved in television, of course, but let's use television as an example. Shows that would have been banned during the 1950s as far too racy, certainly not in line with community standards, have now become family-friendly viewing.
It's the same thing with movies and videos that I am responsible for. Things that were acceptable 15, 20 years ago are acceptable now, and that's how standards have changed over that period of time. And who makes those decisions? And as I mentioned before, it's people like you and I and everybody else. And also the fact that over the years, things are becoming more acceptable. For example, 15 years ago, nudity was something that you didn't see in movies, particularly full frontal nudity. Now, it's not a big deal to people, and society's perceptions have changed over a period of time, and we reflect that in our decisions that we make at the film board.
But what comes first, though?
Yeah.
Well, is it because we're bombarded with these images that we become very immune to it and it's not as shocking to us and it becomes more accepted? Or is it because society really is changing?
It's a very good question, and it's one of the questions we wrestle with. For example, a major question we have is, are we completely the reflectors of society's standards, or should we be a little bit better than the least common denominator of society? I happen to feel that we should be better than the least common denominator. Also, we have to take into account perhaps the size of the population that wants certain changes. I mean, there are certain segments of society that want to have their views and their norms available to all parts of society. And we have a lot of pressure from some of these groups to allow certain types of situations to appear in movies that we're not now allowing. And right now it's a very small segment of society, but how big a segment of society does it have to be before it becomes the norm? I don't have an answer to that, but these are the kind of questions we are constantly grappling with.
What are the guiding principles that you use? Are you merely trying to reflect community standards as high as those standards may be, or as base as those standards may be? Or are you trying to protect society from images that may be potentially harmful? And I'm thinking of excessive violence, excessive sexuality, gratuitous sex scenes, profanity.
I think a lot of it has to do with protection from harm, you know, particularly harm to children. That's always in the back of our mind whenever we classify a movie in a particular way, or whether we're dealing with situations of whether it should be allowable or not. You know, what is the harm to society? And that's not just reflected in our regulations, in our guidelines. It's also embedded in criminal code, that type of thing as well. You know, in the whole area of obscenity, it's what do you perceive is the harm to other people in society, and society as a whole is a determining factor whether something should be allowed or not, or whether it should be called obscene.
What does it say to you, the fact that the Film Review Board has shifted its focus from a body that, you know, was involved primarily in censorship to now rating films and videos? What does that say about how society has shifted?
Well, it says that society has decided that certain things are more allowable now than they used to be. But you know, even though our prime job is classification, we do have the power to censor, and we do exercise that power to censor when we feel that something has crossed the line into unacceptable territory.
What are some examples of films that have crossed the line?
Well, it usually has to do with activities in association with explicit sexual activity, and it's anything that's violent in conjunction with that kind of activity. Society has determined that no, this is not something that's allowable. Anything involving children in that kind of activity has been decided by society that this is not something that should be condoned. You know, we turned down a movie about a couple of years ago that actually was a cartoon that involved child sex, and once people found out why we turned it down, there wasn't any uproar or any particularly reaction to that kind of a decision. You know, we turned down a movie called Caligula, the original version of Caligula, that had explicit sex in it, but also in conjunction with the explicit sex had violence, it had incest, it had bestiality. And those kind of things are past the line of what we feel, and I believe what society feels is allowable.
If society shifts and feels some of those things are allowable, will we just lower our community standards? And again, I guess it gets back to the original question. Is your job to just merely reflect community standards as, you know, if they're fantastic standards or if they're very low? Or is there a protection element, particularly when you're talking about young people?
I think there's a protection element in there too, that we feel that, you know, certain activities, even though society may be condoning them, an example would be like the sadism and masochism type activities that are being advocated as something that's becoming more and more acceptable, and we're saying no, it's not acceptable to that population at large. I feel that our job is not to be the reflector, the lowest common denominator of society's views. I see us much higher than that. I don't see it as at the top of the spectrum either, but we're sort of in the middle there, where that's where the element of protection comes in.
Robert, though, sometimes I think we have seen so many things. I know I'm very, very careful about what I watch on television, what kind of books I read, and certainly what kinds of movies that I go to see. Very, very careful. But I don't even like in my own life how immune and desensitized I have become to sexual scenes, and particularly to violence and profanity.
Yeah. That's right, and that's why
we talk about movies now like, oh, well, it's only violent, as if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, we're very concerned about that as well, and we don't want the kind of activities that we see in the movies becoming the norm for society. And if it becomes excessive, then it becomes the norm for society, and I think that's wrong. So I think we have to set our sights a little higher than that, and I think we do. You know, there's a lot of product out there that would not be approved if it was submitted to us, and the people that produce this kind of product know this and don't submit it to us, but we know it's there, we know it's underground. But if we do start approving this kind of product and we're saying, okay, this is okay for society to look at now, then I think we're shirking our responsibility.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about this, but first we have to take a commercial break. I also want to hear from you, our viewer today. The phone lines are open. The question we're asking, is censorship really necessary? The number to call, 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about the difficult issue of censorship. We're joined in studio by Robert Warren. He's the chair of the Ontario Film Review Board. Before we went to commercial break, we're talking about the fact that censorship, even in a free society, is necessary. But why do you suppose it has come to have such a negative connotation?
Well, I think there's a whole movement called the free expression movement that wants to have no form of censorship on the part of government, that everybody makes their own choices about what they should see and what they want their children to see. And I think that particular movement assumes that everyone is knowledgeable and everyone is responsible. And I don't think that's the case in society today. So I think we have to have something in there to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. And in most cases, that's our children.
So there is a protection element then in your job?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Every time we watch a movie, particularly one that's got a lot of violence in it, a lot of language or some sexuality, we always have in the back of our mind, you know, should young kids be seeing this particular movie? Should we be making it restricted when nobody under 18 can go in? Or should it be a lower classification? If we put warnings on, are responsible parents going to see these warnings and act on them? And we know in a lot of cases that this doesn't happen, you know, that we have parents that can't get a babysitter and they take a 7-8-year-old kids in to see something like a scary movie, and then complain about, afterwards that it wasn't appropriate for their kids when we put all kinds of warnings on them. So there is definitely irresponsible elements out there that I think that that we have to take into account in all this the free expression movement.
Robert, there's a growing body of evidence that shows there is a link between the violence that children watch on television or in films and movies and violent behavior in real life. There's also some compelling evidence that people who are exposed to pornography that it does influence them in very negative ways. So how do you take this growing body of evidence and how does that reflect into what you do?
Well, I think that things go in cycles in society, that there's a loosening up of standards, morality, whatever, and then people start realizing perhaps we've gone too far and sort of cycle back in the other direction. I think that's happening now in society with violence, that people are starting to say it's not all right to have a lot of violence being shown in our TV programs, in our movies, and our videos. And with our video games as well, that kids play and the kids watch and start emulating, and it does have an effect. You know, the people that say it doesn't have an effect on people, these images, then my argument to that would be that why are advertisers spending all this money to influence us through images if images don't influence. So there is definitely a body of opinion, a fairly strong body of opinion. These things do have an effect on people, particularly children.
Well, you bring up an excellent point. Why doesn't the Film Review Board rate videos? Because they can have a dramatic impact on kids.
We do. That's part of our mandate to classify and rate movies as well. So they have to have classifications as well.
I'm sorry, video games.
Oh, video games. Oh, yes. Video games is something that's just recently come to the point where it's so realistic that there is some concern out there. Before they'd been rather cartoon-like, and it's been a little different. But now the movies, the video games that are coming out now are very realistic, and some people feel that because of that, and because that the children control it, it has more harmful effect on them. And you're going to be seeing something from the Ontario government very soon on what we plan to do in the whole area of violent video games.
Okay,
I can't say much more about it right now, but something will be coming.
Well, you have to keep us posted. But whenever you raise the issue of censorship, you know, on the negative side, it's always raised, you know, the specter of book burnings and some wonderful classics that have been banned. And in the 1990s, some of the most frequently challenged books in school and public libraries, at least in the United States, included The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That was number 5, and it was banned because of offensive and racist language. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, because it was blasphemous, offensive, and racist language. And The Catcher in the Rye by Salinger for its profanity, sexual references, and because it was centered around negative activity. So you always have these arguments against censorship.
That's right. There are always going to be people arguing against that, and my point, whenever they do argue against censorship, and the government should get out of the business completely, is that you know, society does draw lines on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and we reflect these lines and try to keep the lines there and sometimes move them forward. And when we get into the period of when certain things are no longer become acceptable.
But other books, though, that have been banned, and I think people might be troubled because of the agenda that it is trying to put forward. Daddy's Roommate is one that was banned. That was number 2. And Heather Has Two Mummies. That was another book. Regardless of where you feel on people's sexuality, I think people are uncomfortable with this kind of agenda being put forward within a school setting. It becomes more than education, it becomes promotion.
Exactly, and that's, I get often asked, you know, are there any taboo subjects from the Film Review Board's point of view? And I said, no, there's not taboo subjects. It's how the subject is treated. You can have, do a subject on child prostitution, for example, and make a documentary about it that would be very, very acceptable on any television station. But when you get to the point where it glorifies it, it shows it in graphic detail, and all those kind of things, that's where it crosses the line, and when it's not acceptable, that's treatment of the subject. And I think that's where we end up with in some of the books as well that you're talking about, is how that particular subject is treated and whether it's advocated and pushed forward as something that's acceptable, and not only acceptable, something that should be in society.
Okay, our phones are ringing. Want to hear your thoughts today. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Let's go to Adam on line 1. Go ahead, Adam. You're on the air.
Hi,
Adam.
I have some problems with the censorship issue. I guess it's, where do you draw the line? I agree. Kids don't need to see excessive violence or sex, but where does the line drawn? You were talking about books like Steinbeck being banned, things like that. Schools having agendas because they have issues with homosexuality. So where does the line get drawn?
Yeah, Adam, you bring up an excellent point. And really, Robert, why should age decide, as it is in Ontario, what I can see?
Well, because of certain things are suitable to certain age groups and they're not suitable for other age groups. Our whole classification process for films and videos is age-based, you know, perhaps books should have the same thing, you know, suitability for certain ages, and then perhaps there wouldn't be the problems of something like The Catcher in the Rye being taken out by kids that are too young to understand and appreciate it. So, I mean, the lines are drawn, I think, and a lot of it has to do with the age of the people that are that is targeted for, and not being seen by people that are too young for that particular age. And that's the kind of thing that we do all the time at the board. It's all age-based. And as far as the caller asking about the lines that are drawn, and that's our whole business of trying to determine what the community standards are. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of serious effort in discussing that as a group and among ourselves and with other groups outside during our public screening nights. So we try to keep in touch with what community standards are.
Robert Warren, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phones are ringing, but we've got a couple of lines open right now. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Today we're talking about censorship, and the question that we're asking today, is it necessary, particularly in a free society? And with her thoughts on this, we're joined by Barbara Laing. She's a spokesperson for the group People Against Pornography. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
How do you answer that question? Is censorship necessary?
I believe it is. I do. And the thing is, with all the pornography that's out there, all of the material that is not age appropriate that's on public airwaves, I know it's hard to say, you know, to stop it or put limits on it, but I think we have to try. We have to make some attempt.
Does it concern you that, let's say, take a body like the Ontario Film Review Board, that basically what it's trying to do is reflect community standards?
Yes, and I heard your last speaker, and I had a bit of a problem with that because it's not only community standards that affect what is being seen. The whole idea of community standards was a Supreme Court decision that was made a few years back regarding the obscenity laws. So it was in actuality a Supreme Court judge who decided using community standards and what was acceptable. So that's a lot, that's quite a lot on one person's shoulders to make that decision about what's acceptable and what isn't. But I still think it was a good decision, and community standards, it's a good ruling to use. What's acceptable in downtown Havelock or is not perhaps the same as Spadina and Bloor.
But how compelling is the body of evidence that what we are exposing ourselves to in terms of entertainment, particularly what we're exposing our kids to, how compelling is the link between what they see and how they behave?
Well, it's very compelling, and they haven't done as extensive, I suppose, studies as far as the connection with violence on TV. That has directly been proven, and nobody has a problem with that. But there are a lot of studies out there by Canadian professors, James Check from York University, Bill Marshall from Queen's, and they have documentation that showing sexuality, explicit sexuality over and over again desensitizes people. And the younger the person who has no idea of what sexuality is, you're imprinting on their brain, you're confusing them, and it opens up a whole can of worms.
Well, something that I shared with Robert Warren when I was talking to him, you know, even take somebody like me. I am so careful, Barbara, about what I watch because I don't want to pollute my own mind.
Right.
But yet it is appalling to me how desensitized even I have become, even being a very careful consumer.
Yes, and we very much believe in the cycle with pornography as an addiction, that it does get to the point where it desensitizes people. And this is why we predicted, like 10 years ago when our group started in the Durham region, we were concerned with just local stores and how they presented their material, and we were saying, well, you know, this is how it starts, and it will get worse and progress to child pornography, for example, or worse forms of pornography, and it has in 10 years. I mean, we've had the largest kiddie porn busts in Canada, and we're not proud of that. But people were saying, oh, not here, not in our community, it couldn't happen. Well, it did, and it's happening today, and it's escalated, especially because of the internet.
So where should we be drawing the line?
I think it starts in the home, as far as the parents have to take that responsibility to say to their children, yes, we have an internet, we have the internet service, we have a computer in our home, kids, but you know what? That's like opening the door and going to downtown Toronto. So we're going to have to lay down some restrictions. We can use it, it's a tool, but we're going to have to use it carefully, just like we would a power tool, Daddy's power saw. Our group says it's education. It's education with parents. Now, we don't just stop there. We also have lobbied to government officials. We have gone to municipal levels of government for bylaws about how they regulate material in stores. And we just recently spoke with the Board of Education, the VIP program, Values, Influence, and Peers, which is in, I believe most school boards have a similar program. And we talked to the police officer who goes into the schools, and they're going to incorporate a computer safety program in that program, the VIP program. And we go out in the community. We have a new book, or a new video and new books. This one was by Safeco Insurance Company. Excellent, and it's at a child's level. The child and the parents can watch this together, and it tells them how to be careful with what's on the internet out there.
Yeah, because it's not just television and movies that you have to worry about anymore.
Definitely not.
Well, Barbara, our lines are very busy today, so let's go to Adnan on line 3. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Is it realistic to believe that you can actually warrant the internet, considering how free and how accessible it is? And isn't it also important to put all these things in context, like violence and sex on TV in context, so that it would be more like an educational thing rather than an influential thing?
Well, Adnan, you bring up a good point, putting it in context, but if a 12-year-old is watching somebody brutally murdered and you don't see any consequences or very little consequences, you know, and you even see that just on television shows that are on prime time, on TV at 8 o'clock in the evening, and movies are much more violent. It's not putting it in context.
Well, I was a child of the 80s, and a lot of the people in Canada were, and we grew up on movies like Die Hard, Rambo, and all these movies with excessive violence because of the Cold War or whatever, but it didn't really, I don't know if that had a huge impact on increasing the murder rate, maybe because the education system served well, so that kids maybe, even at such a young age, actually later on just were able to put it into context.
And perhaps you came from a background of a home that was very supportive. And that's really important. But there are children out there that perhaps don't have the type of parents that you have or the home setting, and they were allowed to have a steady diet of this stuff. And, you know, maybe they just were a little bit weaker, and it may affect them.
So is it realistic to think that you guys can actually protect or guard against the internet, considering there's a generation gap in the education? Like, parents don't know as much as the kids these days, right? Because
that's right, but that's why I think it's important to start young and to get the parents involved with the children right away before the computer even comes into the home, and work with them.
Adnan, I want to thank you for your phone call, but we are already protecting our kids in terms of community standards, and people like your group may think that our standards are far too low in what we're exposing our kids to, but there is a societal attempt to protect children.
There is, and let me just say about the Ontario Film Review Board, our group encouraged people that were concerned in the community to apply to be on the Film Review Board. Not one out of the 4 or 5 that we recommended that sent their letters in were ever accepted, and believe me, that was not a job they wanted to do.
No.
So I kind of wonder about the Film Review Board too. They're kind of hand-picked selections. What happens to them after a period of time? Desensitization occurs, and they fast forward things that they're viewing. So I'm concerned about that as well.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about this, but first we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phone line's quite busy today, but a couple of lines open right now. Want to hear your thoughts. The number to call, 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about censorship. It's a difficult issue, isn't it, Barbara,
Yes, it is.
to balance the right of freedom of expression, which is an important value that certainly we put a high priority on in our society, but yet then there's the overriding need to protect society from a greater evil.
Yeah, and I think that's part of a democracy is that we owe it to the weaker members in society to protect them. Somehow, and that's why I think there should be some restrictions. And you can play with words all you want and call it censorship or restriction, but I think there is a need to do it in some cases.
Okay, phone's quite busy today. Let's go to Jay on line 7. Go ahead, Jay, you're on the air.
I used to enjoy reading the newspaper. It was a pleasure to look through the newspaper. Now there's so much filth in the newspaper, like these sex ads, and all the children are exposed to that material, and they're even calling those numbers. I mean, look in the city where all these papers are free. You know, there's certain papers that are free. It's full of that garbage. And the kids, that's where they're getting these numbers. Their parents are finding them calling these numbers pedophiles, or, you know, they're talking, you don't know who they're talking to.
Yeah, Jay, you bring up an excellent point, and certainly we tend to leave newspapers out of the argument when we're talking about censorship. But you know, a good point my associate producer was pointing out today, a really unsavory, ticky-tacky story about Mike Bullard in the National Post newspaper. And you know, we're not talking about a tabloid.
But newspapers rely on their sponsors. And XXX videos and pornography is big business, multi-million-dollar business. Just recently with White Ribbon Week, it was kind of interesting in one of our local papers where I come from, it did say White Ribbon Against Pornography Week, which was kind of nice because we thought, great, it made the headlines. Underneath that were 4 bottoms of bikini-clad women, and so there was the text, White Ribbon Against Pornography. Not that that is pornography, but it was a tongue-in-cheek, it was a joke that they made. I mean, a lot of the sponsors, or a lot of the ads in that particular newspaper were for pornographic XXX stores and so on. So that's how they make their business. That's how they keep the paper going, unfortunately.
How dangerous, as Jay suggests, is the fact that all of these 1-900 numbers are in your newspaper and accessible to kids?
It is a concern with me, especially as a parent of children in local sports, because they also tend to be right on the sports page or right across from that. And so again, it's a form of an education, and I know we've started with our children young, and maybe it's because of our involvement with the group, but saying, you know, kids, there's appropriate things. There are things for adults and there are things for children. And we're going to go through step by step, and as they have questions about things, but we have to deal with it and tell them there are things that just are not appropriate for you, age appropriate. And even for some adults, some of the material is, you know, against the law. It's illegal.
Do you know, Barbara, some of the things that we're exposed to habitually in movies, you know, you always have that at least one gratuitous sex scene in most major blockbusters, even whether it fits in with the plot or not. Like, who really wants, am I missing the boat here? Like, am I totally naive? But who really wants to see that?
It's sex sells.
And I hear so often the argument, it was a really good movie, just one bad scene.
Exactly, and I share the same opinion that you do. But unfortunately, as I say, they have to look at the consumers and the demographics, and I think it's as people in that young age group that are going to see this. They've been brought up on a steady diet of it. They've been desensitized, and so it becomes very pervasive. It's everywhere. It's in the newspapers and in the movies, and they almost expect that it's going to be there. And they have the buying power.
But to me, it's tantamount to voyeurism.
Yes.
Who wants to watch that?
Again, and our group is, I mean, we've always taken the stance when we go out, it's education, and that somebody will say, well, what about erotica? And what about paintings? The body is beautiful. And well, some, okay, there's some you don't want to see without their clothes on. But love between a man and a woman, it's a beautiful thing. It's a gift. It's just wonderful. And we're not out to say that it isn't, but there are certain circumstances where, again, when we're talking about the obscenity standards, it's not just sex for sex's sake. Those tapes are okay, but it was the violence that was involved, the degrading aspects of it to men and women that were the problem, and we see as a problem as well. It's like a hate literature as far as we're concerned. Indeed.
Let's go to Scott on line 5. Go ahead, Scott. You're on the air.
I just want to say I don't think censorship is really necessary, but like your guest is saying, I really think it has to start with the home, within the home, and the parents, and with ratings on everything, especially music these days. Because I just finished a job at a music store, and Eminem's new album, which raised all this controversy, I couldn't do anything. If these like 7 or 8-year-old kids bought it to the desk, I really had no right to refuse it to them. Wow. Even though some of the stuff they're saying on that album is, like, I'm 22 and it shocked me.
But Scott, even if you put a rating system, an age-appropriate rating system on video games, on CDs, isn't that a form of censorship?
Not really, because it's not, well, I don't feel it is anyway, because it's not limiting what the person is saying. They still have their free speech. It's just getting to the people that, I guess, who wants to listen to it and who it is intended for. Like that movie during the summer, Scary Movie, this shocked me. It was only rated AA, which means anyone under 14, as long as they had a parent, could go see it. like I said, I was 22. It blew my mind what they were showing on the screen. And behind me was a mother with her 2 children that were less than 10 years old. These theaters now, they're so huge, and they don't know who's going in to see these movies. I think there has to be a stronger way to govern who is going in, and maybe the ratings board has to really think about how they have to rate these things.
Scott, you bring up some excellent points. Barbara Laing, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, I think the producers have to have some responsibility too. And because of all the money involved with this, as I say, I don't see it's changing. If they can sell the product, maybe it's got to get to the point where if they can prove some sort of liability involved and there have been cases where people have acted out in what they've seen in the movie. And they have made headlines, cases like that, and I think that has caused restrictions with the violence and ratings to be increased on violent movies where kids have acted out things that they've seen. And again, maybe with the sex aspects of it as well, and sexual predators and so on, when they start to act out, if they can come back and say, well, you know what? It's because I saw this movie, and we get into lawsuits and big money there, maybe there'll be a change at that point.
But is a rating system just based on age, is that enough?
Age appropriate, it's a start. It's a start. And what I think it's there, but it's not being enforced, as the caller said.
Barbara Laing, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's been nice talking to you.
You're welcome.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. A couple of phone lines open right now. Want to hear your thoughts. The number to call is 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about censorship, which really has a negative connotation these days. With his thoughts on all of this, we're joined in studio by Robert Metz. He's a founding member of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
How are you?
And we should state right from the beginning that you were very much opposed to censorship of any kind.
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, in a free society, censorship is totally unacceptable. Censorship I personally regard as being evil. I'll go that far as to say it's evil. Censorship has been with us, of course, for many thousands of years. I've always regarded, for example, the crucifixion of Christ as an act of censorship, which is exactly what it was. The state enforcing its power on somebody because of what that person was saying, not what they were doing, but what they were saying, and because it was not in accordance with the community standards of the time. And so I don't want to repeat that history. And that history has repeated itself many, many times, that any society that has censorship invariably leads to an abuse of that process.
Well, actually, though, the crucifixion of Christ, it wasn't just what he was saying. It was also what he was doing.
Well, to a point, but basically it was his message that was totally in conflict with the standards of the time. And essentially, you know, censorship doesn't just stop at one person's point of view. There's many things that I have to agree with, you know, much of what I heard, things that are offensive to people or things that are unacceptable or personally, you know, not in, you know, sync with what one person may think. But I would never think of imposing my standards and my views and values on someone else. Now, children is another matter. And when I'm referring to censorship, I mean of one adult to another adult. And I just don't think that no matter how far you stretch it, I have no right to impose my views on you, nor do you on me, and that's the social contract we have between us to live in a free society. And
but your choice to view material or even your opinion, how trustworthy is that if you've been totally desensitized by a lifetime of watching explicit material?
Well, what does it matter if I'm desensitized, as long as I'm not hurting anyone? In a free society, what we ban in human relationships is the use of force and coercion. We never ban ideas. There are many ideas out there that are extremely harmful to society, and most of them are political. And you're hearing them right now in the middle of this election, okay? I happen to think a lot of what we hear, if I were the censor of the world, I'd be out there shutting up a lot of people I disagree with.
A lot of politicians.
But the issue is that, you know, censorship kind of says that, well, I don't have a good response to this argument, so that instead of offering an alternative to your point of view, I'm going to shut you up. And that's what basically happens in issues like hate literature. I could never understand why we want to censor hate literature. I say expose it, let the people who are enunciating it enunciate all they want and offer a response. That's the approach we always take. To say that all you can do is shut them up means that I have no answer to racist comments and racist literature and things like that, which I do. And then I'm not even allowed to exercise that because my freedom will be compromised in the same process. So I'd rather see an open discussion and an allowance of all kinds of things within a context of individual freedom. My freedoms end where your nose begins, kind of thing. And I have no right to impose any values on you or force you to watch anything you don't want to watch.
But what if it can be proven that the explicit material, explicit sexual material that has become so much of our modern day culture, and I'm not just talking about in movies, I'm also talking about on the small screen. Some of the stuff, you know, that is viewed in prime time is very, very offensive if you sit down and you think about the message that it's conveying. But what if that is affecting, what if that is affecting my personal life? For example, as a woman, you might not be able to identify with this, Robert, but as a woman, I have to live my life a certain way living in Canada that you might not even be able to comprehend. I have to park my car, you know, a certain spot. I have to be very careful of where I go when it's dark. I have to be, you know, take all of these precautions to protect my personal safety because of the society that we live in.
I'll agree with that, but what has that got to do with censorship or the dissemination of ideas? If we're going to say that something a person saw made them do something, then we have abandoned the whole concept of individual responsibility and that a person's responsible for his own actions. If I can walk into a courtroom and say, Your Honor, I committed this crime because I saw such and such a movie, and he accepts that argument, I just got let off the hook. And the rest of society is being punished.
But what if there is a strong cause and effect? There's a growing body of evidence that there is.
Well, there's a growing lobby of people who want to prove that, but it's just not the case. I know from personal experience. I'm exposed to all kinds of things that I find offensive. I even sat through a censor board display of the things that they show you there. You know, I didn't want to have to sit through it, but that's part of the routine. It doesn't mean I'm going to adopt those values, and it doesn't even mean I'm going to react to a certain scene the way another person might. Two people might see the very same image and have two totally different reactions to it. Again, the line we draw in society is the use of coercion and force, and that's what you're afraid of when you're walking in that parking lot, that someone might attack you.
Right.
You have no way of knowing whether that's what's doing it to them or their prescription drugs or the way they were brought up. It's easy to point at something out there, some object, some other cause, and it perhaps creates some security in thinking that that could be the answer. If we can get rid of the problem by getting rid of the cause, and then we never address the behavior. Behavior, I think, is the issue.
Our phones are so busy today. Many people want to talk to you. Let's go to Frank on line 3. Go ahead, Frank, you're on the air.
I was going to say, in this country, when you talk about censorship, this country we live in, where the other night 4 leaders debated, and only one person pointed out to the fact that the children in this country are unprotected from people like the person you're sitting speaking to, who desires no censorship at all. Her children are at the mercy of pedophiles and anybody who wants to utilize them in an industry that gives them pleasure. Now, the chap sitting next to you is for not censoring anybody, regardless of the people in the industry who are being hurt and being used worse than animals.
Okay, Frank, thank you so much for your phone call. Robert Metz, I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
I said from the outset that children are not part of this equation. We can deal with child pornography using the criminal laws. I don't want to get into arguments over what's obscene and what's not obscene. When a child has been used in the making of a pornographic film or picture, that's child abuse as far as I'm concerned. And we have criminal laws already in place. What happens when we resort to censorship in order to deal with that is that we obfuscate the whole issue. We start arguing about what's obscene and what's acceptable. To me, it's irrelevant. The line's very clear. You're under 18, you're under the age of consent. And consent is essential to adult human relationships, and that has to be left acceptable. So children are not part of this equation, and there's nothing I'm suggesting that would end going after child pornographers, for example.
But isn't it a form of censorship, though, if you're going to determine what somebody under the age of 18 can and cannot see?
No, children don't have the rights that adults do, any more than not allowing a child who's 14 or 13 not to drive on the road is an act of oppression. although some of them might feel that way when they're talking to you. But we acquire our rights as we grow older, and we exhibit to society that we're able to exercise our responsibilities. Now, it's a little arbitrary when we pick the age 18 because you can't have everybody pass a test of some sort. So we have to accept at that point, it's part of the price of being in a free society, that everyone's a responsible individual. And until they prove otherwise, we have no right to take action against them. That gets to be a very frightening kind of scenario.
Hold on to that thought. We have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live and more of your calls right after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. We're getting short on time, so let's go right to Cindy on line 5. Go ahead, Cindy, you're on the air, but you'll have to make it quick.
Thank you. I believe that censorship is protecting children and society from ignorance, because we need to hear both sides of the story, and when we see pornography or other things that are, like that, we're not always getting both sides of the picture, and pornography, it's proven, it leads to other sexual addiction and the desensitization. So this is an imperfect society. We need someone to lay some laws down to help us and protect us all.
Yeah, Cindy, you bring up an excellent point. Don't we need some sort of protection, even to protect us from ourselves?
I think censorship makes us more ignorant, not less so. I mean, if you censor information, then you have less information from which to make your opinion on. We have to accept in a free society that good and evil exist. I accept that. Now, does that mean that evil has to be brushed under the carpet so that we don't see it? I don't believe so. I think it has to be exposed for what it is and addressed as such. The issues over what constitutes evil and what constitutes good are part of the debate. And I think that in order to have that debate, we require a lack of censorship in our society in order to be able to arrive at that conclusion. We have citizens out there who are voting on certain issues, and if they're deprived of the information they need to do that issue. You know what happens most time with censorship is that when someone actually sees the object of censorship that's being censored, they're generally going, well, that's not as bad as I thought it was. It sounded a lot worse when they described it to me.
Robert Metz, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And that is our show for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back here again on Monday. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great weekend.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.